Yeah.
Go for it,
Cool.
Geek.
Thanks. Yeah. So this first item in the agenda is something that has been brought up by Martin from QE a while ago, and I first dismissed it as not a bug, but after rereading it since it came back, and also accounting for extra not necessarily from me, but opinions on this shared by Jim. I'm now changing my mind. I think that indeed is a bug. So basically, it's a very specific use case where you have two policies that target the same level in a hierarchy. And when you say the same level, I mean, for example, two sections of a gateway, two sections of an HTTP route, or two entire HTTP route, right? Or the same HTTP route entirely twice. That's what I mean. So whenever you have two policies that have the same level, and one of those policies states an override, right? Specifies an override, and the other one specifies either explicitly or implicitly a default. According to the spec, the override policy should win. However, that's not what we're doing. What we're doing instead is we were jumping from the list of rules for resolving conflicts according to the spec straight to the next bullet point that says use the creation timestamp of the resources. That's what we're doing, right? So we're basically making the oldest resource win always, regardless if it's an override or a default. And I can see now how that can be confusing to some users that say define at the same level a default and an override. And I dare to say that most people would expect the override to win, regardless of the timestamp, right? And indeed, that's what the spec says. So according to the spec, at least, that is a bug, right? So we need to address it. We need to account for that aspect of the policies as well before starting applying, the meta strategies in the stack. The thing is,
there's two different rules. Then one is if there is no override, then it's the creation timestamp. If there is an override, ignore the creation timestamp, go with the override.
Correct. Yes, because we always solve that for every pair of policies, right? So that means we actually have four combinations. Those two policies can be default, override, default, override, right?
Yep.
So the only case where the override would win is, the cases where you have the two types, the two kinds, right, of merge strategies. In those cases, the override wins over the other, right? But if you have obviously override, the oldest one continues to win. If you have default, the oldest one continues to win. Yeah, go, Alex.
I'm not sure it's best. Honestly, I think the good news is we can ask the people who wrote that, but I think what the spec says to me is not entirely clear. I'll be honest. But so what would it mean if, sorry, I'm searching for the thing here again. Yeah, here we are. So I'm looking at the example, right? So as you say, right, we have policy 1 and we have policy 2. It so happens that policy 1 has defaults, policy 2 has overrides. But now if I would have some defaults inside policy 2, are you saying that then I imply that policy 1 is the eldest one, right? But I mean sequentiality. I don't. That's what I expect, right? But so what would happen then? Are we saying that the defaults, that only the override section from policy 2 is the one that's going to be overriding policy 1, and the defaults inside policy 2 are just going to be dropped on the floor?
That is a good point that you're raising. One thing to have in mind, though, is that a policy cannot be simultaneously defining an override and a default. It's either or, right? So it's either it defines a default or an override. But we still have the case where it used to be an override and you turn that into a default. And what you're describing still applies, right? So if you had policy 1 and policy 2 respectively specifying default and override, and then you turn policy 2 into a default, right? Suddenly policy 1 wins, right? It used to be policy 2, but now it's policy 1
Right.
because you turned the default an override into a default. Correct. Another thing that you mentioned is we could reach out to the people who wrote that in the first place and ask, right? I dare to say that the text is quite straightforward, right? It leaves it doesn't leave much room for interpretation. I think it is what it is. But on the good side, though, is we are currently in charge of rewriting that text, right? And we're not completely obliged, to follow that. We could say, hey, Quadrant's implementation went a different direction. We thought that it's too confusing for users, to reason about those combinations. Right. So we went straight to creation timestamp, and to the new text that we will be sending the final pull request soon, we could already propose to drop that one rule.
So follow-up question though, just to have my mind refreshed. Like, what was the timeline there? Was having those two policies always quote unquote legal?
Yes. The spec never imposed any constraint regarding that, right? And I think it's kind of, in a way, it's kind of inherent of policy attachment, because right. You now define specification from a resource from the outside. I think it's hard, to avoid right. That you have conflicting policies targeting the same level.
But so the thing that changed, correct me, like, sorry, like, I haven't looked into this in a while. So it used to be a many-to-one. I mean, many policies targeting one thing, and now we have a many-to-many, right? That's
correct. Yes,
that's the thing that changed.
Yeah, but that's not the reason, right? We have this problem. We already
I
know.
I know. Sorry, I'm just trying, because I know, well, definitely some text there was written prior to some change happening.
Yeah.
I think the multiple target refs happened after that was written. I understand it has no impact, but so that's what I was trying. I was trying to reason the timeline back.
Yeah, I guess it was actually the other way around, because this is part of a gap 713.
Yeah,
which was before the plural target refs. But yeah.
Oh yeah, but that's what I'm saying. That's what I was saying. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I was saying exactly that. But even though it has no impact, so it's fine. But so that's why I just want to, it's all work in progress, right? So I just want to be sure. And then plus, as you said, is it really the most desirable outcome?
Yeah, I think now you're touching on the most important point of all, right? What is the behavior we want here, right? What makes more sense to a user, right? Do we want to enforce that one rule that is in the spec and we missed, right? And if the answer to that question is yes, then I have a follow-up one, which is that would be a breaking change, right? So by the time we release 1.1 with this change, right? Let's say whoever has multiple policies at the same level in 1.0 should expect possibly a change in the behavior, right? So is that what we want, or do we think, collectively that it makes more sense for a user only to consider timestamps and not that additional aspect?
What's up?
Yep. Go ahead, Craig.
Naively, I think it's simpler when there's just one rule for how this works. I mean, overrides and defaults is like already pretty complicated. If you start adding in even more dimensions, like, it feels like it kind of has the opportunity to become incomprehensible, right? So for me, and I try not to be tainted by our implementation, but for me, it was kind of surprising to hear that. Like, I'm trying to think of, like, why would I want that? Why would I not just change the original policy if that's the case, right? And like, I'm struggling to think of a use case where, like, oh, I actually want that behavior. So that's where my head is at right now, but I've only just really put that into my brain as we've spoken. So
yeah, it's a good point, right? Because I think it's fair to assume that if the two policies target the same level, and especially now a case where we do not allow cross namespace targeting, right? Only in the same namespace, I think it's reason to assume that the user owns both policies, or at least has enough permissions to has enough control over those two policies.
Yeah.
So why not just changing the other one, right? To add a little spicy, to the case here, consider that those policies could be not necessarily atomic policies; they could be merged, right? Could be using the merge strategy. So maybe you're defining an extra bit, right, in the form of another custom resource that is to be merged inside of another set of policies, right? So maybe you want to override partially and do not want to go through the existing set of policies. I'm making stuff up, right? So maybe that's not enough of a reason. Maybe we should say, yeah, it's too hard to reason about that. Just go back and edit your policies, right?
Yeah.
I'm just saying that there's more in that than I may have described.
I do feel the answer to this is use case driven, as in if there's like a really solid use case for adding that additional complexity that like we see a lot of people may need, like then okay, the complexity is worth it for the use case that it's going to solve. But if we don't see one, or we're having to like make one up, then it's a bit of a struggle for me to kind of say, yeah, it's worth all this extra complexity, Yeah, so I guess that's the way I would come at it, is like maybe asking that question upstream as well. Although you're saying that we're kind of driving that now. So like, what is the problem that's solving, and is it enough? Is it valuable enough to force that complexity? You muted, Guy.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. So maybe one question we could ask, the original authors of the gap is, and I can do that myself, I can reach out and ask, is if there was indeed a use case behind that one rule, right? Because maybe there was one and we do not have to make up stuff, right? But if there isn't, then I'm inclined to agree with you and say, let's just drop that, and I think it's okay at this stage if we just say, hey, Quadrant implementation, we decide at the moment not to honor that rule, right? I think it's easier for users to reason about this if we use just the creation timestamp. But before, we settle on this, right? Yeah, thanks, Jim. I was about to push you under the bus, but gladly you raise your hand before that. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm asking a different question. Like, is there a different way that this can be solved? Like, we're trying to come up with a use case of why you'd want to put an override onto a resource. And I can kind of see it being used in a temporary fashion. But is one of the possibilities, we don't support it right now, but adding that override at the gateway class level rather than the gateway? Because it's only the gateway that can accept the overrides.
Again, it's not. It used to be only the gateway that accepted overrides. It's not anymore, right? Now you can set overrides at any level.
Oh yeah. Sorry, and it'd be the section name one is the only one where it doesn't actually apply. But yeah, like I'm wondering, is it if you're trying to override stuff, should you be going a level above it rather than at the level you're trying to override it?
Yeah, I think that maybe the answer to the question is, if you're trying to affect only the same level, right, a level that to have access to already, right? Why don't you just go there and change the existing state, right, of your policies? Why don't you just rewrite your policies? So it's not that you need to go one level up, right, if you want to modify a given level. If you have access to that level, just go there and set policies for that level, right? If you have already policies in place, modify them.
This is the answer to me. Like I can't, like, you need a very, very specific RBAC rule to stop somebody doing that. Right.
Well, that goes to the level of the name of the resource, right?
You need to be extremely explicit with that. So that's not a common thing, right? So
Mhm. It is possible, technically speaking,
sure,
but I also struggle to see a use case, where you necessarily want to do it that way.
yeah. I do think with all of this stuff, like it's a complex area. So just being careful about layering on more complexity is always worth just stepping back from a little bit. Just because it's written down, I mean, nobody, like, we're the implementers of this at this stage. So doesn't mean that it has to necessarily stay that way.
True, yeah. So maybe a couple action items here before we settle it, even though I think we're more or less in agreement, right? One is, and I can take them all, right? I can reach out to, I think it was Nick Young, right, who wrote that in the first place, or I can go back now to history and see if that was recommended by somebody else. But anyway, I can get to the bottom of it and find out whether there was indeed a use case behind it. And number two, that's a little harder, but we can also try to find if the current implementations of inherited policies are currently honoring that rule or not, and how they are doing it, right? There aren't too many doing inherited policies at the moment, so it shouldn't be hard, to at least to find the names. We may not get the answer, but we can, at least we know how we're trying to do that right.
It sounds good to me. Certainly better than jumping into like just changing and potentially breaking behavior. Not that I see too much risk with that in the current state we're in, but still ideal, not just jumping in and making the change just for the sake of it makes sense to me.
Okay.
There's probably
sorry.
something. Oh, sorry, Alex, you go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, I had my hands up and didn't work, so I just dropped it. And now I'm rereading the whole thing as well, but I still believe there might be a bug. If policy 2 is created first, it works as expected, and policy 1 is being partially enforced.
Yeah, policy 2 is, well, it's only being partially enforced if it's a merge, right? And it also depends on the names of the rules. But I think that's by spec, if you can say that, because we were the ones who created that in the first place. We invented that, right? So the concept of merging two policies at that level.
Oh,
I'm not
because
aware
the
of anybody
policy,
else.
because the
Yeah, because the
policy
strategy was
2, the
merged,
first
yes.
one stating that it's mergeable, effectively.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. Yes.
Right. So it accepts that. But then,
Mhm.
so if I would have said strategy merge at level policy 1, it would have worked?
Again, it depends on the name of the rules, but provided the two rules are conflicting, then you have to pick one of them. The oldest one would win, right? Regardless of the other one being an override. The point is, the way we did this is, when you order the policies and you start, applying them, the one with the higher priority defines the strategy always, right? So if we are ordering the policy by creation timestamp, the oldest one among the two is defining the strategy, right? So if it says it's a default merge, it's going to be a default merge. If it says it's a default atomic default, and so on, right? So regardless of the other one, what the other one says, if the other one says override, it doesn't matter, because you already ordered the policies based on creation timestamp only. So I think the proposal was, before ordering the policies or while ordering the policies, consider this strategy also, because maybe the strategy matters, or according to the spec, it does matter, right? According to the spec, if you have an override, the override should come first and it should define the strategy.
All right, I'm reading your comment there. Yeah, okay. Yeah, then, yeah. I concur. Like, I think we should try to keep this simpler. Because then if you add another policy 3 as well, that again is override, well, that one gets ignored, but not the first one. And I understand you can explain all that stuff with, yeah, but those are the rules. Yeah, sure, but I think it violates the principle of least surprise.
Okay, so I think we all agree that compared to this
Sorry,
spec,
because I cut off Jim, and now Jim
Sorry.
has his hand.
yeah, go
I
Jim.
guess you don't see who has.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to say is when I seen this before, it was very unclear what was going to happen. So I think we need to do something with the status as well to make it sure that it's clear that this one is not being used and is being ignored. It's probably just one of the improvements that we do need to do either way.
Yeah, I think everybody will agree with that, and myself included. So we definitely need to improve the way we report that back to the user using the status stanza for sure. If it helps, I would say that at least that's what helps me, right? Maybe it's not fair because I wrote that part of the code, so I understand that not everybody sees it the same way. But I always visualize that stack of policies. Right, so it's important that you have in your mind the hierarchy, right, in the background, and then you see the policies, hence our visualization of the topology, and then you think on the policies on the stack, and you start applying the policies in order, right? Every policy that you pop out from the stack dictates the strategy, and you merge that in the next one. And then the next one dictates the strategy again for the next step, and so on until you empty the stack, right? So maybe we can come up with a way for users to better visualize that process, right? Maybe it's in documentation, maybe even inside of the current tooling that we have, for visualizing the resources. I don't know, but that's how I see it, right? You need to see just one single list of policies, right? An ordered list of policies. And I most of all have to thank Alex, because this links way back, when we were first, exploring with this idea in the policy playground maybe a couple of years ago, right? So the idea of one single line of policies, right, that you're applying in order is, in my head, is the easiest way, to make sense of this.
Okay. I think that wraps that one. Alex?
Yeah, I haven't really prepared this per se, but so there's a thing that I talked about a few times already that I think would benefit, let's say, people working on the stack, is understanding the data flow and the data dependency. So yeah, the data dependency, the data flow, and everything. But when you think about it, actually, what we're doing right now is imposing all of that complexity on our users. And so an example of that is actually a few use cases that came back to us where people would want to try to achieve things and they believed it wasn't feasible. And it's actually very feasible to do what they wanted. It's just, it's not that it's not documented. It's up for you to figure out how to wire all those bits together. And in order to be able to understand how to wire those bits together, you need to have a good understanding of all the individual bits, how they all fit together, and so forth. So I'm thinking that maybe we've been looking at a too low-level abstraction to expose our to our users so far, and maybe, and again, I'm a quote key in this thing because I think he's the one who first introduced a few of us actually on this call with this concept of meta controllers and meta policies that would effectively that would raise the abstraction level and make it so that we come up with policies that are, I'm going to say, self-sufficient and solve a problem completely. So there's a few examples of that. I think some that we already talked about is like OAuth flows, SSO, and whatever, because as of today, we expose all the complexity of the auth pipeline through the auth policy to the users. But if you think that's complex, and I think authenticated rate limiting, especially if you go to something where you want to support plans and other concepts that are quote unquote very vague, it's up to you to understand, okay, what do I map a plan, this idea of a quota-based thing based on some piece of information, to rate limit policies? How do I wire all this stuff together? How do I now come up with an auth pipeline that actually lets me get some kind of data about, let's keep on picking on Guy, about Guy, what plan is Guy in, right? And then maybe what you get from let's say from wherever, actually, I don't care. You get a piece of information and you know that Guy is a developer on Kuadrant. As such, he would belong inside I don't know, diamond plan, very obviously, like the very best plan there is. Now you need to do that mapping, right? And you're like, oh, how do I do this? Well, as it turns out, we have all the foundational blocks to solve all of those problems, right? Oh, yeah, and then I can add to the mix because I like that one, because this PR opened by Guy that I would really not want to merge. And I'll explain why on the PR after this call. You want to decide as well that maybe Guy is only diamond during working hours, right? Because we know Guy then works overnight because he can't sleep, but there we don't want him to work at night. So we're like, well, you'll be on the crap plan. So you need to introduce time into this and so forth. Well, today, doing all of the above is absolutely feasible. It's just you're on your own to figure out on how to do it. And you need to wire all those individual bits together and yourself, right? So people thought that they need some kind of a custom policy SDK to be able to write their own rate limit policy or whatever, right? And this is what sort of made me wonder, are we looking at this wrong? And actually what we have today is the custom policy SDK. I'll get in a little bit more detail about that in a sec. But what we miss is those abstractor, like those higher level abstractions, but again, to quote Dijkstra, that are very precise about the problem they're solving in like one single place, right? What about if I could have like this plan stuff that expresses how to map an identity to a plan, and right below that are the plans listed that I care about, right? I can look at this thing now and I see how the mapping happens and so forth. Yes, this wouldn't have solved, for instance, where do we get the identity from to begin with? But that's, I'm gonna say, almost an orthogonal problem, right? So you could have an OAuth policy, for instance, that does the identity part. You could have then the plan stuff that sort of encapsulates all that things. I'm not saying that's the way to solve it. What I'm trying to say is raise the abstraction that we're dealing with, and use what we've built so far actually as the building blocks, because I think they're already very powerful. One additional thing that I want to make, and then I'll shut up, is I think the introduction of cell is actually pretty key to all of what we're discussing as well, because one, it's a pretty already out of the box powerful language. Everything that I just described modulo some bugs actually is feasible without this, nothing really that you have to do, right? It just all is, we can support that. But there's probably other things that we may want to do. Another thing that came up is smart load balancing, where possibly you want to have some kind of a state to know how many things are currently in flight to, say, a pod. And so you want to make sure that all the pods are equally under load, right? That's a stateful thing. Now you need to share data in between request scope. If that makes any sense? Again, we have all the tools to make that work, but maybe not as neat as people would want them to work. So the other nice part with cell is that it's extensible. So we can add functions to the cell that we support in all of our components. That's important, so that we can support advanced use cases. Yeah, and that's what, I think if we flip that mindset around, in like this, what we have today becomes effectively the playground for us to use to define what the ideal SDK that we would want to give to customers to play with would look like, by first eating on dog food and solving the problems that we know we want to address in a much, I'm going to say abstracter way, but i.e. more precise way, and most importantly, a way more user-friendly way, right? Rather than forcing them to understand cell, all the functions that exist, the data flow, and so forth. So now I shut up, and I think Guy's at the top of the, well, or the bottom of the queue, or the top of the stack, or whichever way you look at those data structures.
I don't know if I'm reading too much into what you said, or you actually said it, but let me double check. Are you proposing that what was previously presented as meta policies based on that project called meta controllers to be the custom policy SDK that we provide?
No, sorry, no. The meta policies become the entry point into Kuadrant. That's the outermost API that we expose for people to get stuff done. And actually, they're built upon the stuff that we have today. I'm going to focus on the data plane, but so rate limiting, auth, policies, and cell, right? All of those things are composed using those underlying blocks.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying we take those away from the user neither, but they remain there as they are, and you can solve this use case that people thought wasn't solvable yourself if you think that's fun. Be my guest, right? But yeah, sorry.
No, you said, and you can solve that use case that people thought wasn't solvable. I think that is key here, right? Because maybe we should step back and define custom policies and the actual ask behind it, right? Because maybe I'm wrong, but my understanding was not that I agree with it, right? I very much like what you are suggesting here, if I understood correctly. But if I remember correctly, custom policy was once defined as a way for users to do things that our building blocks cannot do today, right? So maybe they are aware of all the building blocks. They know how to operate them, how to combine them, but they still find use cases that we cannot cover with the existing set of building blocks. And they still want to build their own custom thing, to be hooked into our pipeline. An idea, by the way, that I'm very scared of, right? So I'd rather not do that. But that was my understanding about custom policies, right? So not things beyond what can be done with the set of building blocks we provide, right? Personally, I very much prefer that the users can only do what our set of building blocks can do, right? And in that sense, then if we provide abstractions that simplifies, for particular use cases, I think that's good. Even though I wouldn't probably, put that under the name of custom, right? In fact, it's pretty much the opposite of it, right? So it's less custom, and maybe by custom, I would say if you have access to that tool we use to translate from one level of abstraction to the other, then maybe you are also able to create your own custom abstractions, right? But yet, always limited by the set of functionalities that we provide with our building blocks.
Yeah, okay. Let me quickly go. Yes, to everything you said. The thing is, I guess there's two ways of looking at this custom SDK. Whatever I'm not challenging what you explain as being the source of the requirement, right? But there's two ways of going about it. Either we introduce another layer in between what we have today and the building blocks that we use, right? Because people can, if they want, go, use Envoy as of today, and if tomorrow we abstract over another thing, they can go below, they can, right? Effectively, you could almost argue we have not really control over that, right? So it's their infra. They do whatever they want. So either we do that, or what we do is we grow horizontally what we have today. And that's sort of what I'm implying here. So possibly new policies, new types of policies along the ones that we already have, and possibly extend the cell function set to support, again, very domain specific use cases, right? That's what I would call grow horizontally what we have today, in order to that become a more full-fledged toolbox for people to do whatever crazy stuff they want. And I think that checks the box that you're describing, that I certainly agree with, that, yeah, we need to keep that under control. Because if people go below, right, where below is not the stuff that we own anymore, there's many things that become unknown and really hard to control, right? They will break things for sure. There's no way this doesn't happen. So this is sort of why I'm sort of, instead of thinking of the custom policy SDK be a new thing, it's actually, we have a start of it already there with what we have. I think we just need to grow that set. But I also believe that an SDK is only as good as the stuff that it enables. In order to enable stuff with it, you need to implement it yourself first, right? Dog food your own thing. So that's why I'm proposing this kind of, I don't know, bit of a shift in the thing. Craig?
I think you answered my question there by saying extending horizontally, because I was going to say it sounds like we have, I'm just writing it down here, like we have the auth and rate limiting custom SDK, but we don't have like, hey, I want to do cores, right? Or I don't know, some other use case. So maybe that's what you're saying there by extending it horizontally.
Yes. I don't want to pick on the course example specifically, but yes. That's what I'm saying. Let's grow like this, I don't know, those granular blocks as we have them, let's grow them, but let's build more specific ones on top. And that would be, you know, again, so that, because, yeah, anyways, I don't want to go into a philosophical rant here.
So I really like the idea of the meta policies, which we've kind of talked about a few times. One of the reasons I really like it is, one, I think we can define some pretty good use cases that we can solve with them, that could be solved just with the rate limit policy and auth policy or whatever, but is much more user friendly. But two, I think it's like really good dog fooding, right? Like it forces us to actually use our own policies to solve those higher level problems. And we might find that like there's some stuff missing, or that we have to like repeat stuff over and over again from time to time. And it's like, actually, you know what? Like I think you said that, Alex, right? Like maybe that's a new function that we need to add in, right? So I really like that for that reason. And yeah, I definitely agree with both of you on trying to avoid opening the can of worms that is allowing people to kind of inject actual code.
One advantage that I see as well, by the way, is we can iterate over then those new functions, new policies and whatnot, right? Like we don't need to commit, like we can have V1 stuff if you prefer, like at the higher level abstraction, and say, okay, if you want to get more power, sure, but we're less committed necessarily to those APIs as of today, right? Not that we want to change them, but if we can make them better, as you just said before, right? Redundancy, whatever. We certainly want to be able to do so, because the idea is to provide the best tool possible for the job.
Right. So do you mean that those new meta APIs might be like a V1 alpha API initially?
No, I meant the ones below. Say we introduce the core one, right? You could say, okay, this is good for, let's say, not like you, that's a bad example again, but right, a thing that plays in, let's say the OAuth run, right? And from there, you realize that the auth policy can be made better, right? And let's say the auth policy is one of those new things that people don't, that we don't force upon people to use on day zero, if that makes sense.
Okay. Or
functions, a new cell function. You're like, okay, I'm introduced that, but not necessarily documented, right? We document it as, alpha,
Right.
We think it's good. Please use it. if we all agree it's good, then it'll remain that way. But if it sucks for this and this use case, then we'll revisit.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think like what brought this up was the planning calls, right? So probably need to regurgitate this idea to other people.
Hey, well, I have my hands up. One hand up. Sorry for being late in this call, by the way. One question: when you say you can be more specific, can I understand that as yes, you can be very specific, but in a limited scope? Like you can also be very specific right now in what we have, but you have to be specific in a long list of things. What does specific mean?
Yeah, I think you in your question, I think what I hear you say is the you is not the same person. So right now, we ask the user to be very specific about how to solve their use case. In the other ways, we become specific in the way that what we ask of them to solve their use case, right? So I don't want to pick on a particular example because I don't want to steer this one way or another, right? But if I reuse the example I used before, today it's up to you to figure out where you write what cell expressions in order to get, for instance, the plan mapping out. And now you need to write this, need to know that you need to feed that in there and somehow be able to get it back inside your rate limit policy to apply the proper plan. How do you spec all those plans? In different rate limit policies, into one, to create one per foobar, and what do you link them to, right? It's a way you need to understand a way. Okay, so the philosophical rant I didn't want to go into is today we're forcing down the throat of our users to understand a whole lot about our solution in order to solve their problem. I don't think that's correct. What we should do is get closer to the customer. What are the most, like the 80% rule, right? What are the use cases that they're trying to solve? How can we provide an API that they just look at and they just go, I know how to fill the blanks in here. And they drop that inside their clusters and it all works. I think that's a much nicer user experience. And that's what I mean by we are more precise in what we will be solving for them, right? Say, see the OAuth example again. OAuth, give me the basic stuff. I'm not asking you to write an auth pipeline. Like anybody new approaching Kuadrant doesn't even know what an auth pipeline is. And I don't think they should know that to get started. Eventually they may, right? If like that's
Yes.
the point of view I'm trying to flip.
Yes. Would you agree that it also means by when we like designing those meta policies that there's going to be a lot of no. We're not going to do that in this meta policy. Like we have to say no enough in order to make it actually a meta policy, because before you know it, everything is there again.
No, that it needs to be an abstraction. Not hey, we massage all those fields differently.
Right. Right. So we're not going to solve everybody's problem with each policy. We quickly say with the meta. Sorry, we quickly say no. For that use case, which might only be slightly different from the customer point of view, you'd use the other meta policy, for example.
Yeah. And then I hope that over time we get to the confidence that we have the building blocks in our custom policy SDK, which is whatever we decide to bundle all underneath. What we have today, again, is rate limit, auth. I would include DNS, TLS in there, absolutely. And then sell, right? For people that then need, and possibly as I think Guy said that, right? We maybe have a Go SDK that lets you write much easier your own so that you can come up with a meta policy of your own that does, I don't know, Microsoft authentication policy that only Microsoft cares about, and they can still leverage all of what we have underneath, right? So at that stage, they could provide the more specialized tools for whatever environment their user set, right? So that would be more targeted again to the ops people, DevOps people that would then, write those things so that their application or Barclay or I don't know, BMO or whatever, which bank you want to choose, and can write their own policies, right? But over time, once we're confident that we actually solve the other set of problems pretty well with those building blocks. Sorry, Craig.
Yeah, I'm just going to kind of echo what David is saying here. I do feel like there's probably still a gap there where, yeah, if we don't expand horizontally, we don't allow people to actually solve custom use cases where it's like, I have these random requirements that I need to call out to all these services and inject some data and do some weird business logic that results in a 301 redirect. Who knows, right? So that's the bit I think that we'll probably be missing here at this stage.
Yeah, just to be really clear, I was by no means saying that this custom SDK, as I'm trying to look at it right now, is complete by any means. Don't get me wrong. And it's probably not even necessarily the complete proper abstraction necessarily, right? I don't know. But instead, I guess the mind shift is focus less on shipping auth, rate, and whatever next policy would have been, rather try to say, all right, what we do is we build those building blocks to enable the things that we actually give our users to use first.
Yeah, I like to think of it a little bit like the common policy catalog. They have like loads of different policies, but they're actually all just iterations on an old policy, most of them. But when you look at it as a user, you can see it very clearly. It's like, oh, there's my thing that I need to do, right? So I could see that being quite appealing from a customer perspective, as in, oh, I can see how I can solve my use case with Kuadrant because it's right there in front of me, right? It's not like I have to dive through every use case in the auth config to figure out how to do that via auth config. It's like, oh, there is a JWT policy right there in front of me. Okay, I'll use that, right? So I don't think anybody. I think we're all pretty strong on this meta policy idea. I think it's like, yeah, I think we need to probably bring this back to some others as well and see if it solves enough of the problem space.
Well, again, though, just to be clear, I'm not arguing to remove anything anyways, right? Whatever we do today would still work, right? And then again, as I say, it looks like there is a little bit of gap in understanding there because what people thought was not possible is actually very much possible.
Yes.
So all of that is still there, right? What I'm saying is emerge higher level abstraction that make it much easier to approach. Which those are, I don't know, to be honest, based on certain input. I have some ideas of stuff that we can certainly play around with. And then the question becomes, when new stuff come around, hopefully we can identify that they sit at this higher level abstraction, but also miss some foundational bits, right? That would then necessitate and require us to grow, again, that foundational layer horizontally to support more stuff.
Yeah, I wonder if capturing those use cases in issues and then driving those forward with meta policies up to the point, like, I think this is what you're saying, sorry, Alex, driving those forward up to the point that we can't for some reason. And then like now we have a rationale for something different, right? Like, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to like solve, because I agree with you, the use cases that we've seen, they seem solvable because they're often related use cases. So they seem solvable. So we can probably solve for the use cases, and then
right.
Yeah.
Though actually, there was like like we're both referring to a SIMDoc. There's like two use cases there. Another one is related to load balancing that we don't address at all. I don't even know if we can. There's a few things I need to understand a little bit better. I started educating myself there. But see, that's a good one where I think we could grow horizontally already. And what we
Right,
do,
yes.
again, we could also be silent about it, you know? Maybe we introduce a load balancing is a bit of a crap one because it's partially addressed by Gateway API itself, right?
Yep.
So we need to find a neat way to sort of expand on that, which I think is somewhat feasible. And then if we can actually make all that work, like we probably miss some nouns and some verbs, as I like to call them, right? To express that in our SDK, right? But we could add things that we don't necessarily get like like yell about on rooftops, right? So that you can then reuse those in a different thing over a longer time and validate that what you did is something you're confident that we can commit to. Or
Yep. Okay, so is there any actions out of this, Alex? Was there anything that you want to define as we should do as next steps here?
well, this sort of is because yeah, that there is. Okay, I'm gonna talk BU stuff now, and I shouldn't do this here. But there was this entire like way back when, and I bugged on it for quite some time, but I have quite some notes on it for what was called like the plans, right? We need sport plans. Based on the stuff that came back, I think we can sort of start looking at an API to start doing that composition work. And the good news is that I think we can do that without needing to grow horizontally yet. I think we have all the tools to do that. What would be it's sort of an exercise in finding the proper abstraction. That's actually what I'm would like that we do for the next sprint, whenever that starts. If that's, I guess that's concrete enough as a action item.
Is there any GitHub issue around this?
Nope, not yet.
Well, that would be even a more concrete action item.
Yeah, I have a really hard time naming it. Yeah. And then we need to identify tributes. I started poking someone on this call about this already that has their camera on and happens to be based in Newcastle.
Okay. I think, yeah, GitHub issue, come up with some name. That would be certainly a starting place so that we can start to see some of it come together as issues and sub-issues as things get discussed. Okay, we're on the hour. Apologies again for opening my email. We're generation distraction, so apologies for that.
Thanks.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.